Hi, friends, and welcome back to True Crime Echoes. When most of us think about air travel, we picture convenient speed, maybe even a little glamour. But behind every smooth takeoff and landing lies a history that is far darker than the glossy ads and champagne glasses would have us believe. Today, we're diving into the story of aviation, not just the invention of planes, but the broken promises, the scandals, the discrimination, and the tragedies that have followed us into the skies for over a century. From the fragile airboats of 1914 to the jet-fueled dreams of Pan Am, and finally to the unsettling whistleblower deaths of our own time, the history of flying is less about freedom and more about risk, control, and power. So buckle up, because this isn't the story of smooth flights and sunny vacations. This is the dark history of air travel. Chapter 1. The First Dreams of Flight. When I think about flying today, it feels so normal. We book a ticket shuffle through airport security, cram ourselves into a seat, and hope the plane takes off on time. But if you roll back the clock just a little more than a century, flight wasn't normal at all. It was magic. In 1903, the Wright brothers managed to keep a small wooden contraption in the air for 12 seconds. Just 12 seconds. That was all it took to completely change the future of human travel. People who witnessed it must have thought they were seeing something out of a dream. And in a way, they were. That shaky little flight didn't just prove we could fly, it proved that gravity wasn't going to hold us down forever. But here's the thing. In the early days, airplanes weren't about convenience or travel. They were more like sideshow attractions. You'd go to a county fair, see a man spin and dip in the sky, and that was the entertainment. Crowds gasped and cheered like they were watching a circus act. For most people, the idea of boarding a plane themselves wasn't even on the table. That started to change in 1914. In Florida, a curious little machine called an airboat made history as the first commercial airplane to carry paying passengers. It wasn't glamorous. No enclosed cabin, no rows of comfortable seats, just an open bench for the pilot and one brave passenger. But on January 1st, 1914, a crowd gathered to watch the airboat take off from St. Petersburg and land in Tampa. The trip lasted just 23 minutes, covering 18 miles. To us now, that sounds like nothing. But back then, the only other option was to take a train around the bay, a grueling 11-hour journey. Imagine that 11 hours down to 23 minutes. People's minds were blown. Some must have thought, is this time travel? That's how radical it felt. Of course there was a catch. A ticket cost $5, which doesn't sound like much today, but in 1914 that was about a quarter of the average monthly salary. Translated into modern money, it would be roughly $160. So sure, it was possible, but only for those who could afford to throw away nearly a week's wages just for the thrill of sitting next to a pilot on a noisy wooden plane. For the average family, that was a sacrifice. For the wealthy, it was a status symbol. And it worked. That little airboat became the first scheduled service, flying 4 times a day. Crowds kept showing up not just to ride, but to watch. The sight of a machine lifting into the air still felt unreal, like witnessing a miracle. In those early years, air travel wasn't about efficiency, not really. It was about wonder. It was about possibility. Still behind that sense of wonder was a quiet reality. Airplanes were fragile, unpredictable, and very far from safe. Sitting on a rickety wooden seat wrapped in a coat against the cold wind, you weren't just taking a trip, you were taking a risk. Yet people lined up anyway. That hunger to fly, to rise above the earth, even for a few minutes, was stronger than fear. Looking back now, I see how those first flights set the stage for everything that came later. They planted a dangerous idea that the sky was open for business, and once money got involved, the race to turn flying into an industry began. But that's when the darker side of this story starts to creep in, because when profit mixes with dreams, history shows us it rarely stays romantic for long. Chapter 2. War in the Skies. Not long after those first thrilling flights, the dream of commercial aviation hit an unexpected wall. In July 1914, World War I broke out, and suddenly, airplanes weren't circus attractions or luxury novelties anymore, they were weapons. Every country that had begun tinkering with aviation shifted its focus to the war effort. The question was no longer, can we fly, but how can we fly better, faster, stronger than the enemy governments poured money into research, and engineers were pushed to design machines that could scout battlefields, drop bombs, and fight in the sky. It's strange to think about war as devastating as it was ended up fueling the growth of aviation more than anything else. With conflict came funding. With funding came innovation. The very first dogfights, those battles between planes high above the ground, were terrifying, but also proof that flying had moved beyond curiosity. Planes had become tools of survival. And in the middle of all this chaos, a man named William Boeing found his calling. Bill Boeing, as people called him, didn't start off as a pilot or even an engineer. He was a wealthy businessman, the kind of man who could afford to dabble in big dreams. In 1909, at a simple air show in Seattle, he saw a plane lift into the sky for the first time. That single moment changed his life. He was hooked. He bought planes, took them apart, studied how they worked, and taught himself the mechanics of flight. And with his family fortune behind him, he wasn't just dreaming, he was building. By 1916, he had launched his own airplane company. At first, he called it the Pacific Aero Products Company. The name didn't stick. A year later, he renamed it Boeing Airplane Company. That name, it stuck. During the war, Boeing secured government contracts supplying aircraft to the military. What began as an obsession quickly became an empire. And after the war ended, those planes didn't just disappear. They had to be used for something. What was once built for destruction started inching back toward transportation. But here's the thing. Even as the war created opportunities, it also shaped how the aviation industry would evolve. The military routes of early planes meant that safety and comfort weren't the priority. Durability, speed, and cost were. Those values carried over into the way companies like Boeing approached passenger planes. In a way, the DNA of commercial aviation was written on the battlefield. When I think about that, it makes me wonder, was air travel ever truly designed for us, the everyday passenger? Or was it simply a byproduct of war softened and repackaged for public use? Either way, by the early 1920s, airplanes were no longer novelties. They were becoming part of an industry. And that industry was just getting started. Chapter 3. The Mail Takes Flight. When the war finally ended, there was a moment when it looked like airplanes might fade back into obscurity. The government no longer needed fleets of fighter planes, and ordinary people certainly weren't lining up to buy tickets. Planes were loud, dangerous, and expensive to operate. For a while, it seemed like the dream of air travel might stall before it ever truly began. But then, of all things, it was the mail that saved aviation. In the 1920s, the U.S. government had a problem. Delivering letters and packages across the country took far too long. Trains were reliable, but painfully slow, and with America stretching coast to coast, there had to be a better way. That's when they turned to airplanes. The first official airmail routes were launched in 1918. Pilots, often young men who had just returned from the war, climbed into fragile open-cockpit planes and set off across the country with sacks of letters strapped beside them. It was dangerous work. These weren't sleek jets, they were wooden frames covered in fabric, barely more than glorified kites with engines. Pilots navigated by sight, following rivers, train tracks, or landmarks below. One wrong turn in bad weather, and you were lost. Many didn't make it back. Still, it worked. Slowly but surely, airmail routes expanded, connecting cities and proving that airplanes had a real practical use. And with government contracts backing them, companies like Boeing had steady work repairing old planes and building new ones. It's strange, isn't it? We think of flying as this glamorous invention of luxury, but in reality, it was the humble letter, the everyday postcard, the bills, the love notes that carried aviation into the modern age. By the late 1920s, some of these planes weren't just carrying mail anymore. They began carrying passengers too, but only the wealthy could afford the ticket. And even then, it wasn't glamorous. Planes were cramped, freezing, and rattled through turbulence like tin cans in the sky. Yet people still paid for the privilege, because no matter how uncomfortable it was faster. A train ride that took days could be shortened to hours. And for the rich, speed meant status. Flying wasn't just about getting somewhere, it was about being seen doing something extraordinary. Looking back, it almost feels inevitable. Once the mail proved airplanes had value, it was only a matter of time before the industry shifted from delivering letters to delivering people. Chapter 4. The birth of glamour in the skies. By the early 1930s, flying had already proven itself useful thanks to the mail, but something else was about to change the industry forever: the introduction of flight attendants. Now, let me paint the picture for you. At that time, there weren't attendants like we know today. If you needed help on a flight, it was usually the co-pilot who came back to check on you. Imagine that the guy responsible for flying the plane leaving the cockpit to hand you a blanket or calm your nerves. Safe, not really, but that was the system. And then came Ellen Church. She was a nurse from Iowa who dreamed of becoming a pilot. Of course, back then, women weren't allowed to fly planes professionally. But Ellen had an idea. She walked into Boeing and pitched something new: put women, specifically nurses, on planes to look after passengers. Her reasoning was simple, but genius. Who could possibly admit they were afraid of flying when a calm, capable woman was smiling right there beside them? The airlines took the bait. In 1930, Ellen and 7 other women became the very first flight attendants. They weren't just serving meals, they were keeping passengers comfortable, reassuring the nervous, even tightening loose seats when turbulence rattled the cabin. These women were the difference between flying feeling like a death-defying stunt and flying feeling like a service. From there, things began to shift. Airlines realized that if they wanted people to pay for the privilege of flying, they couldn't just offer speed, they had to offer an experience. Flights began to be marketed as exclusive, glamorous journeys. Men wore suits. Women wore pearls and furs. Champagne was served in crystal glasses and smoking was allowed in the cabin. It was a world designed to make passengers feel like royalty, even if the planes themselves were still cold, shaky, and dangerous. This period became known as the Golden Age of flying. But the truth, it was more about image than reality. Yes, there was glamour, but behind the champagne flutes and the glossy advertisements, flying was still risky. Engines stalled, turbulence was wild, and safety standards were nowhere near what they are today. Yet people were hooked. Flying wasn't just travel anymore, it was a statement. It was about being part of a new, exciting world where only the elite could afford a ticket. That's the paradox of early aviation danger dressed up as luxury. And while the airlines dazzled their passengers with smiles and service, the cracks beneath that polished image were already beginning to show. Chapter 5. Behind the Golden Image. When people today think about the so-called golden age of flying, they picture crystal glasses of champagne, well-dressed passengers, and smiling flight attendants in crisp uniforms. And yes, there was glamour, there was elegance. But if you dig deeper, the reality wasn't nearly as golden as the advertisements made it seem. For one, let's talk about who was actually welcome on these flights. Air travel in the mid-20th century was still very much an elite experience. Tickets cost the equivalent of thousands of dollars today. That meant only the wealthy could afford to fly. Middle-class families, forget it. For them, trains and buses were still the only way to travel. And then there was the issue of who you were. Flying may have looked modern, but socially it carried all the same prejudices as the world on the ground. People of color often faced blatant discrimination, sometimes being forced to sit in separate sections or even removed from flights if a white passenger wanted their seat. Even famous figures weren't immune. Jazz singer Ella Fitzgerald, for example, was once barred from reboarding her plane during a stopover. She sued and won, but for most people, justice wasn't that simple. Then there was the treatment of women, especially those who worked as flight attendants. Airlines sold passengers on this fantasy of charm and beauty in the sky, and they built that image on the backs of young women. To even be considered for the job, attendants had to meet strict requirements. They had to be under a certain weight, unmarried, childless, and usually under the age of 32. If they got married or gained too much weight, they were fired. Airlines didn't hide it either. They openly marketed their attendants as part of the experience, using slogans like "Fly with us" and "Meet the prettiest girls in the air." So yes, on the surface, the golden age seemed luxurious, but beneath that polished image was a system built on exclusivity, inequality, and exploitation. Flying wasn't for everyone. It was for the wealthy, the privileged, and those who fit into the carefully curated picture the airlines wanted to sell. And yet, despite all of this, flying continued to grow. More people began to dream of stepping into that world, even if it meant buying into an illusion. Chapter 6. Jet age dreams, and Pan Am's rise. By the time World War II ended, the aviation industry was completely transformed. The war had poured billions of dollars into building better, faster, and safer planes. What had once been fragile wooden frames were now powerful metal aircraft capable of flying longer distances, carrying more people, and withstanding harsher conditions. This was the beginning of the jet age. And at the center of it, all stood Pan American Airways, better known as Pan Am. If there was ever an airline that symbolized the glamour and ambition of post-war travel, it was Pan Am. They branded themselves as the world's most experienced airline, and for a while, it wasn't just a slogan, it was the truth. In 1947, Pan Am began offering around the world flights. Think about that for a second. For most of human history, the idea of circling the globe was unimaginable. And now you could buy a ticket climb aboard a plane and be whisked from New York to Paris, from the Middle East to Asia, and back to America again. To the wealthy, this wasn't just travel, it was a symbol of status, of living in a future the rest of the world could only dream about. By the 1950s, Pan Am's planes got even bigger and better. The introduction of the Boeing 707 jet changed everything. Flights that once took 14 or 15 hours could now be cut in half. Suddenly, New York to London wasn't an exhausting ordeal, it was just an overnight trip. And while ticket prices were still high, the idea of flying began to feel more possible for the upper middle class, not just the ultra-rich. Inside the cabin, airlines leaned harder into luxury, plush seats that converted into beds, multi-course meals prepared by renowned chefs, champagne flowing like water. For some, it felt like being in a 5-star hotel in the sky. Ads promised sophistication, romance, and adventure. It was less about the destination and more about the experience. But beneath the surface, the same old problems lingered. Racial discrimination was still common, and flight attendants remained subject to harsh rules that treated them less like professionals and more like props in a marketing campaign. The industry was growing, but it was still built on exclusion. Even so, this period from the late 1940s through the 1960s became known as the true golden age of air travel. For those who could afford it, flying felt limitless. It felt like stepping into the future. Of course, that illusion wouldn't last forever. Chapter 7. Cracks in the Golden Sky. By the 1960s, air travel looked unstoppable. Jets were faster, airlines were expanding, and flying had become the ultimate symbol of sophistication. But like with many golden ages, the shine started to wear thin the closer you looked. One of the biggest cracks showed up in how airlines marketed themselves. Ticket prices were tightly regulated by the government, so companies couldn't really compete by offering cheaper fares. Instead, they competed with image, and that meant turning their flight attendants into the face and often the bodies of the brand. The job requirements for attendants were ruthless. Women had to be under 130 pounds, remain unmarried, and retire by the age of 32. Imagine that your entire career depending on your looks, your weight, and your relationship status. Airlines plastered ads with slogans like, "Does your wife know you're flying with us?" or "Fly me." The message was clear. Flying wasn't just about travel, it was about sex appeal. And sure, the glossy ads brought in customers, but they also created a toxic work culture. Flight attendants were pressured to perform a role that was less about safety and service and more about being part of a fantasy sold to male passengers. It was exploitation hidden behind a smile and a uniform. Meanwhile, outside of the cabin, the industry was changing too. More airlines were entering the market, leading to fierce competition. With ticket prices fixed, the only way to stand out was through luxury marketing stunts or cutting costs elsewhere. It was a dangerous balance, and cracks were forming in the promise of safety first. Even Pan Am, the crown jewel of the skies, wasn't immune. They were growing fast, stretching themselves thin across international routes. For now, they were still flying high, but storm clouds were gathering. The so-called golden age was glamorous, yes, but it was also deeply flawed, built on sexism, inequality, and an unsustainable model that couldn't last forever. And soon the turbulence that was quietly building behind the scenes would shake the entire airline industry. Chapter 8. The Fall of the Golden Age. By the late 1970s, the fantasy of luxury air travel was starting to crumble. The golden glow of the industry dimmed as the realities of money politics and practicality set in. One of the biggest turning points was deregulation. For decades, the government had controlled ticket prices, routes, and even competition between airlines. But in 1978, the U.S. Airline Deregulation Act changed everything. Suddenly, airlines were free to set their own prices and choose where they wanted to fly. At first, this sounded like a win for passengers: cheaper tickets, more choices. And yes, for the average traveler, it opened the skies in ways that had never been possible before. But for the airlines, deregulation was brutal. Smaller, low-cost carriers started popping up everywhere, undercutting the big names with budget fares. Legacy airlines like Pan Am, which had built their brand on luxury and exclusivity, struggled to adapt. They had huge overhead costs, massive international routes, and a business model that didn't fit this new competitive world. Fuel costs were another blow. The oil crises of the 1970s sent prices skyrocketing, making it harder for airlines to stay profitable. Suddenly offering champagne and steak dinners on every flight didn't make much financial sense. Airlines were forced to cut back, trimming the very luxuries that had once defined the golden age. For passengers, this shift was complicated. Yes, more people than ever could afford to fly, but the experience was changing. Seats became smaller, services became fewer, and flights grew more crowded. Flying was no longer an event to dress up for, it was just a way to get from point A to point B. And then there was Pan Am. The airline that had once symbolized glamour and global ambition began to collapse under its own weight. Unable to compete with budget airlines and crippled by financial struggles, Pan Am started selling off assets just to survive. By 1991, after decades of defining air travel, Pan Am flew its very last flight. To many, that was the moment the golden age officially died. The skies were still full of planes, but the dream of luxury in the clouds had been replaced by something much more ordinary, an industry chasing profit, often at the expense of comfort and at times safety. The fall of the golden age was a reminder that glamour is often an illusion, and when it fades, what remains is the hard truth of how things really work. Chapter 9: Broken Promises in the Modern Sky. By the time the 2000s rolled around, flying had become completely different from those champagne-filled days of Pan Am. It was no longer about glamour or exclusivity, it was about efficiency, cost-cutting, and survival in an increasingly competitive market. For passengers, that meant fees on top of fees. You paid for your ticket, sure, but now you also paid to check a bag, to choose a seat, even to get a snack. Air travel was accessible to more people than ever, but it came at the cost of comfort. The skies weren't glamorous anymore, they were crowded, stressful, and often miserable. Behind the scenes, something even more troubling was happening. Companies like Boeing began outsourcing massive portions of their manufacturing to subcontractors all over the world. On paper, this strategy was about speed and efficiency, build more planes faster and at lower cost. But in reality, it created cracks in quality control. And when it comes to airplanes, cracks, literal or metaphorical, can be deadly. By the late 2010s, Boeing faced multiple crises. The 737 MAX, a plane designed to compete with Airbus, was rushed into production. In 2018 and 2019, two of these planes crashed within months of each other, killing hundreds of people. Investigations revealed disturbing truths: mechanical flaws, inadequate training for pilots, and serious questions about what Boeing knew before the tragedies occurred. And then came the whistleblowers. Workers inside Boeing factories began speaking out about shortcuts, faulty parts, and pressure to prioritize speed over safety. Joshua Dean, a quality inspector, noticed planes leaving the factory with the wrong screws installed in their doors. When he raised the alarm, he was ignored and eventually fired. Another whistleblower, John Barnett, spent years warning about substandard parts being used in production. Both men died under suspicious circumstances, fueling speculation that these weren't just tragedies but part of a darker pattern. Suddenly, the illusion of safety in modern flying began to crumble. News reports showed doors flying off mid-air windows, cracking engines failing. The public couldn't help but wonder, has air travel ever really been safe? Or have we been told a story of security while companies cut corners to protect profits? The truth is chilling. Flying has always carried risk, But today, much of that risk feels avoidable, and that's what makes it even harder to swallow. From the glamour of the golden age to the chaos of modern times, the story of air travel is a story of broken promises. The promise of safety, the promise of comfort, the promise that technology would always protect us. And as history keeps showing us, those promises are fragile at best. Chapter 10: The Uncertain Future of Flight. As we look toward the future, it's hard not to wonder where flying goes from here. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that the skies have never been as safe as glamorous or as secure as we've been told. Air travel has always been a mixture of innovation and illusion progress wrapped in problems. Today, the industry faces challenges unlike anything from the past. For one, there's fuel. Scientists warn that the world could run out of conventional jet fuel in less than 100 years. That's within the lifetime of our grandchildren. Companies like Boeing and Airbus are experimenting with biofuel synthetic alternatives made from plants and other renewable sources, but so far the technology isn't ready to replace the billions of gallons burned each year. Without fuel, planes don't fly, and right now there's no clear backup plan. Then there's the issue of climate. Air travel is one of the fastest growing sources of greenhouse gas emissions. Every flight taken is a reminder of the environmental cost we pay to shrink time and distance. Will flying someday become a luxury again, not because of price, but because of ecological limits? And finally, there's safety and trust. The crashes, the whistleblowers, the stories of shortcuts and corporate negligence. They've left many of us questioning the very machines we step into. Flying has always been an act of faith. You strap yourself into a metal tube 30,000 feet in the air and trust that it was built right, maintained right, and flown right. But faith is fragile. Once it's broken, it's hard to repair. Still, people keep flying. We keep moving across continents, across oceans, chasing family, business, adventure, escape. Because in spite of everything, the risks, the costs, the frustrations, flying connects us in ways nothing else can. Maybe the future of air travel will look radically different: electric planes, new fuels, or even technologies we can't yet imagine. Or maybe we'll look back and realize that the so-called golden age wasn't in the past, it was right now, during this imperfect, complicated, messy moment in history. Whatever comes next, one truth remains: the story of air travel is the story of us. Our ambition, our flaws, our need to reach beyond what seems possible. And just like the passengers of the first shaky mail planes, we're still holding our breath, strapping in, and hoping that the wings will carry us where we need to go. And that brings us to the end of today's journey. Looking back, it's clear that flying has never really been as safe or as glamorous as we were told. It's always been a trade-off between innovation and illusion progress, and cost, speed, and safety. The next time you step onto a plane, remember you're not just a passenger. You're part of a story that stretches back more than 100 years, one built on ambition, mistakes, and survival. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden side of history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to True Crime Echoes, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your own experiences with flying, the good, the bad, and the terrifying. Until next time, stay safe, make good choices, and remember the truth: much like the sky is often darker than it looks.